Now watch this drive.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Eyes Wide Open History of the CIA. Today, in part 2 of our series, we will be covering Operation Sunrise, Allen Dulles' scheme to ensure that Nazi Germany would persist after the end of the Second World War. As will be customary from now on, we will begin with a very short recap of last episode's topics, to make sure that everyone is on the same page about the topics that were discussed. I want these videos to stand on their own, so that new viewers can follow along, even if they missed previous parts. That being said, if you did miss the last part, do not fret. There's a card on the screen right now to link you to it if you want to check it out before, but that's totally not necessary. You'll be able to understand what I'm saying, at least to a certain degree. As always, I cite all my sources in the description of every video. When you see a number pop up at the top of the screen like this, you'll be able to find a matching bibliographic citation in the description. Without further ado, let's begin. In the first episode of this series, we explored the origins of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the CIA. The OSS was directed by a man named Wild Bill Donovan, who recruited agents primarily from the American elite class, mostly from Wall Street, corporate law firms, and business circles. Wild Bill's top agent, Allen Dulles, was a lawyer at the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, one of the preeminent corporate law firms on Wall Street. Dulles will go on to become the CIA's first civilian director, and be an instrumental force in expanding American intelligence. He will be a very important character for the beginning of this series. Sullivan and Cromwell, Dulles' law firm, represented several dubious clients, such as IG Farben, the German petrochemical megacorporation that manufactured the Zyklon B gas used in the Nazi gas chambers. IG Farben held an instrumental role in the Nazi war machine, manufacturing synthetic fuel and synthetic rubber, two resources that Nazi Germany desperately needed for the war effort. Allen Dulles continued to serve his clients' interests throughout the war, defying FDR's policies of unconditional surrender in Europe, as we will see throughout this episode. Now that the recap is complete, let us get into Operation Sunrise and the second part of this series. For most of the war, Allen Dulles was stationed at the OSS office in Bern, Switzerland. The setting was perfect for the dubious intelligence agent, as the neutral ground allowed him to parley with Nazis and fascists throughout the war, without attracting attention from Allied forces. One such meeting was with Nazi General Reinhard Gehlen, the head of the German military intelligence apparatus. This meeting was quite different, however, as it didn't take place in Bern, Switzerland. It actually took place in the state of Virginia. Let me break it down. During the war, Gehlen's agents worked across the Eastern Front, tracking down fugitive Jews and sentencing them to their doom in the Nazi camps or in front of a death squad. He reportedly got most of his intel from Soviet prisoners of war, and was known to employ torture as a main method of interrogation. Gehlen, being deeply embedded in Nazi intelligence, saw that the war was ending, and that Germany would lose if it had to face a US-Soviet alliance. But much like other high-ranking Nazis, he believed that there was a way that Nazi Germany could survive the war, through a separate peace. So, Gehlen devised a plan to meet up with advancing American troops in southern Bavaria. He brought with him a case of microfilms, detailing intelligence he had gathered about the Soviet Union. Upon meeting with those advancing troops, he then proceeded to leverage the intelligence that his agency had gathered to gain an audience with the leading agent in the budding OSS, Allen Dulles. Gehlen was subsequently shipped off on a DC-3 to a comfortable quarters at Fort Hunt military base in Virginia. There, he had a personal meeting with Allen Dulles. Upon meeting Gehlen, Dulles was immediately impressed with his resume, and saw some use in the organization that Gehlen had left behind in Nazi Germany. Dulles decided that it was in the West's best interest to use the Gehlen org as a stay-behind army to subvert communist groups in Western Europe, and decided to send Gehlen back to Germany with US military handlers to continue to operate covertly. Gehlen reportedly began putting together clandestine guerrilla armies of ardent fascists and Hitler Youth that he organized into, quote, werewolf squads, who were ordinary citizens by day that turned into ruthless communist killers at night. This program would be administered under a US-backed paramilitary network in West Germany known as the Gehlen Organization. The werewolves would eventually be renamed to gladiators under the future CIA operation known as Operation Gladio. These would form the backbone of the future post-war European political climate. They would be activated at war's end and play an instrumental role in West German politics and the rest of Europe, as similar secret armies would be formed across the continent. Gellin himself would eventually be reinstated as the head of West German intelligence, the BND, in the 1950s, becoming a legitimate part of the West German security state. Therefore, the Gellin case illustrates the clear revolving door between the Nazi Party and the future framework of Western European security. I wanted to highlight the saving of Reinhard Gellin here to introduce this character, as he will be recurring throughout this series, but also to show the background of the stay-behind networks that would form the backbone of Operation Gladio. As is so often the case in early CIA history, Allen Dulles was the architect of this plan. Now, Allen Dulles shared Gellin's aspiration for a separate peace with Nazi Germany, and would do everything in his power to reach that goal. These actions were highly treasonous, as FDR had promised Stalin at Casablanca that he would not sign a separate peace with Germany, and would follow the Soviet policy of unconditional surrender. Dulles' moves to secure a post-war Reich were potentially explosive to the alliance between Russia and the United States, which ended up winning the Second World War. This, however, did not deter Dulles from moving forward with that plan. Dulles worked closely in Bern with international banker Thomas McKittrick of the Bank of International Settlements, or BIS for short. BIS had been founded in the 1920s to ensure the disbursements of reparation payments from Germany to the Allied powers following World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. By the 1930s, however, BIS had been fully integrated into the Nazi financial system. 5 BIS board members were card-carrying Nazis in 1940, and the bank was used to store stolen gold, art, and Nazi profits, much of which had been stolen from Holocaust victims. In response, the Roosevelt administration had implemented a policy called Operation Safe Haven that sought to confiscate Nazi assets from banks around the world. The fear was that these Nazi assets would allow the German elite to bide their time after the war and potentially regain control for the Reich at a later date, using these slush funds to fund their rise. This policy directly impacted the Dulles brothers, as 2 of their major German clients at Sullivan and Cromwell, IG Farben and Merck KGaA, the German pharmaceutical giant, had funds stored in BIS from their war profiteering in Nazi Germany. Both Allen and Foster Dulles, forever helpful to their clients, would see that BIS funds would remain with their Nazi clients until the end of the war. Foster Dulles, the Sullivan and Cromwell law partner, and Allen Dulles' brother, created an intricate network of shell companies that would shuffle BIS funds in a dizzying and complex series of transactions. This essentially worked to launder the dirty Nazi dollars. Allen Dulles, the OSS agent in Switzerland, then worked to destroy all paper records of these transactions, essentially shielding his brother Foster from any investigations. He was well placed for this as well. The headquarters of BIS was in Bern. Some of these assets would never be recovered, ending up in the hands of fascists across Europe. Much of this funding was unaccountable and likely aided in building the underground far-right networks that developed across Europe during the Cold War. Now, there's a couple of key takeaways here. Firstly, Allen and John Foster Dulles were beginning to display their cunning efficiency when they worked together as a team. The Dulles' circumventing of FDR's Operation Safe Haven foreshadows the brothers' future work they would undertake as CIA Director and Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. Together, this team would lead Eisenhower's foreign policy apparatus, conducting some of the most blatant and illegal acts in American intelligence history. The acts undertaken by the Dulles-Eisenhower team would also cement the CIA as a ruthlessly efficient organization that gets results, no matter the cost or the morality of the action. The second element to note is John Foster Dulles' use of shell companies to circumvent financial oversight. Shell companies are fake corporations created usually by intelligence agencies or organized crime elements to mask illegal financial transactions. Shell companies will play a central role in the CIA's future operations, especially when drug smuggling or organized crime elements are involved. I think it's interesting to see this strategy used so early by the elder Dulles brother, but also, just as a side note, the use of shell companies is part of the reason why learning this history is so difficult. Following financial transactions is both tedious and difficult because of how complex these transactions can become. So when we get to more complex topics such as Iran-Contra or the French connection, we're going to see that shell companies play a large role and purposely obfuscate the public's knowledge of these transactions and of what these agencies are actually doing. Some of Dulles' most treasonous and morally reprehensible acts during the war were his concerted efforts to save Nazi war criminals from justice at Nuremberg. The big three Allied leaders, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, had warned the Nazis that their war criminals would be punished to the full extent of the law. When the war came to a close, Churchill and Roosevelt even proposed taking matters into their own hands and personally shooting the 50 to 100 major Nazi war criminals on their list. It was actually Stalin, the man of steel himself, that recommended that they hold a trial to give their punishments legitimacy. The site they chose was Nuremberg, the German city that had once been the chosen location of Leni Riefenstahl's monumentous Nazi propaganda film Triumph of Will, which featured endless crowds of adoring Germans cheering on the Führer himself. In 1945, Nuremberg was quite different than that scene. It was a desolate place, much like the rest of Germany. Holding the war crime trials at the once illustrious propaganda center of the evil empire was clearly symbolic. Following the announcement of the Allied war criminal policy, Allen Dulles and Wild Bill Donovan immediately got to work devising plans to free useful Nazis from justice at Nuremberg. During their deliberations, Dulles and Donovan targeted, firstly, Hermann Goering, the Reichsmarshal of the Third Reich and Hitler's named successor. For the Wall Street OSS agents, Goering was simply one of them. He had amassed massive amounts of wealth during the war, organizing and consolidating the German steel, mining, and weapons industries under the Reich. He seemed like a perfect candidate for a potential separate peace, and clearly had immense resources that could be used to rebuild an anti-communist Europe. However, Goering was too high profile for even Dulles and Donovan to save. It would have raised too many alarm bells at the White House. They decided to focus their efforts on Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's personal banker. Schacht came from the same elite world as Dulles and Donovan, and remained a respected member of the international banking class in London and New York throughout the war. Most importantly for Dulles and Donovan, Schacht knew the location of the hidden Nazi fortunes that had been tucked away before the fall of Berlin. Well, long story short, Donovan was able to circumvent Robert Jackson, the Supreme Court justice assigned by Roosevelt to oversee Nuremberg, and he was able to save Schacht from sentencing. Allegedly, Dulles and Donovan fabricated sympathetic stories about Schacht that he was exiled from the party and harbored no anti-Semitic views. This was all fabricated. Although Donovan and Dulles were able to save Schacht from the gallows, not even these two men could save the interminable Goering, despite their best efforts. As we will see in the next section, which will comprise the rest of the video, Hjalmar Schacht was only one of many Nazis saved under the OSS's Operation Sunrise. Now, before we move on, there's one last thing that I will not be covering in detail, but is definitely worth checking out if these topics interest you. Immediately after the war, the US military intelligence apparatus, so at the Pentagon, got to work on Operation Paperclip, which was a scheme to smuggle Nazi scientists out of Europe to work on the American space program and nuclear weapons technology. Since this operation is not directly linked to the CIA, I will not cover it in detail, but it does plainly show how the entire US security state shared a desire to work with former Nazi elements to subvert the Soviet Union. Interesting note to make, this is the last time I'll mention Operation Paperclip specifically. On April 26, 1945, 2 weeks before the end of the war, SS General Karl Wolff, Himmler's chief of staff and a high-ranking Nazi war criminal, was surrounded by Italian partisans in an alpine estate at Lake Como in northern Italy. Wolff had been charged with the occupation of northern Italy following the collapse of the Italian fascist government in 1943. He was particularly hated and targeted by the Italian resistance fighters because of his revenge killing of civilians following attacks on SS locations, and the torture of several partisan fighters. Wolff had distinctive Aryan features, which made him somewhat of a celebrity in Nazi Germany. Allegedly, he had a close personal relationship with Hitler, who used to parade him around at high-ranking Nazi dinners as an ideal Aryan specimen. Ultimately, Wolff was a Nazi until his death, recalling his cherished memories with Hitler into his old age. Luckily for the embattled Wolf, he fit into Dulles' post-war vision of a separate peace with Nazi Germany, to block the Soviet-aligned Italian partisans before they reached the Eastern Front. This would guarantee that the West would have a say in post-war Italy. Wolf was a key of this plan, which Dulles called Operation Sunrise. Dulles realized that he could not take on the operation on his own, at the risk of insubordination, as the FDR administration was following a policy of unconditional surrender, as I had previously mentioned. Dulles instead put Gero von Schultz-Gavernitz on the mission instead. Gavernitz was the son of an illustrious European family that had funded Hitler's early rise. His family had broken away from the Nazis shortly after the war broke out, but this was less by his own volition and more by the Nazis cutting them off. Dulles had helped the Gavernitzes smuggle their money out of Germany during the later years of the war, as he had done with many other Nazis. Dulles had done a massive favor for the Gavernitzes. He decided to cash in that favor and task Gavernitz with saving General Karl Wolff. Gavernitz organized a team of agents to go rescue the SS commander. The team departed in the evening, accompanied by OSS agent Don Jones. Don Jones, known as Scotty by the Italian partisans, was a known agent in the region, having gained the respect of the Italian partisan network by actually doing what the OSS was created to do, fighting alongside the partisans and sabotaging Nazi forces. Scotty betrayed those that he had fought alongside during the Nazis' brutal northern Italian campaign. He was tasked by Dulles to provide cover for the rescue team during their convoy to Lake Como, and he was honored to do so. The convoy was made up of a motley crew of OSS agents, Italian partisans, and 2 SS agents that would help secure their passage through the checkpoints. The rescue party was attacked several times by partisans, but Scotty bravely jumped in front of the gunfire, hoping that the partisans would recognize him. This strategy mostly worked, despite the convoy getting hit by grenades and gunfire throughout the night. When they finally arrived at the Lake Como estate late in the evening, Wolff was awaiting them in his SS uniform. He offered them scotch that had been stolen from the British during the North African campaign. Shortly after, he changed into plain clothes, and they began their journey back to Chiasso. By 2 in the morning, the convoy safely returned to Chiasso and met back up with Gavernitz. Wolff was filled with gratitude for Gavernitz for saving him, and Gavernitz proudly shared the story of his Operation Sunrise mission for the rest of his life, writing about it sentimentally in his diary years later. On May 13, 1945, shortly after the Operation Sunrise rescue, Wolff was spending his birthday with his family and fellow escaped Nazi war criminal Eugen Dolman at the Villa of the Dukes of Pistoia in Italy. That afternoon, they were abruptly greeted by American tanks and Italian partisans, demanding Wolff's arrest. Wolff and Dolman were quickly escorted to the Bolzano dungeon, set up for Nazi war criminals. Although, they were swiftly transferred to the more comfortable prisoner of war camp at Cinecittà, the former Italian movie studio that had been converted into a POW camp. There, he was given special treatment, due to letters from Dulles recommending him as a moderate gentleman. He was given better food than the other prisoners, and even allowed to wear his SS uniform and sidearm while in the prison. Dulles had promised Wolff immunity from trials and stood by his promise, due partly to his respect and use for Wolff, but also due to the serious repercussions to his own career if Wolff testified about his treasonous acts in Operation Sunrise. Wolff was later transferred to a small US POW camp in Gmunden, Austria, which featured a lakeside resort and spa. Wolff was then reunited with his family and was also personally delivered his yacht, which he used that summer on the lake nearby. That same summer, the Nuremberg trials were taking place, and Chief Prosecutor Justice Robert Jackson wanted Wolff to stand trial as a, quote, major war criminal, which he clearly was. Dulles immediately got to work clearing Wolff's name, burying and destroying OSS documents that labeled Wolff as a mass murderer, complicit, and instrumental to the Holocaust. Instead of receiving the true reports of Wolff's atrocities, Justice Jackson at the Nuremberg trial received a report that labeled him as a, quote, moderate Nazi, and most importantly, a, quote, gentleman. Wolff did appear at Nuremberg, but as a witness, testifying against Hermann Göring. As the first rounds of trials ended, the Nuremberg Committee continued their noble quest to bring justice to outstanding Nazi war criminals. Wolff's name continued to be floated, as he was a high-ranking member of the SS. Dulles responded by forging a psychiatric assessment of Wolff, which diagnosed him with psychosis and landed him in a mental facility. Dulles tirelessly worked to save this horrible man because he saw a future for him in post-war Europe. But Wolfe also held a trump card: blackmail. Wolfe knew that Dulles was being insubordinate by attempting to save him. To continue to pressure Dulles to take increasingly illegal and immoral steps to free him, Wolfe even sent a letter to Harry Truman outlining some details of Operation Sunrise. Dulles was furious, but he had no choice but to continue working to free Wolfe. Finally, in 1948, Dulles was able to secure Wolfe's transfer to a jail in Hamburg. There, he would be put on trial, not for war crimes, but for, quote, denazification purposes. During the trial, the judge read a glowing affidavit personally written by Dulles, recommending that Wolfe not be prosecuted. The ever-loyal Gavernitz appeared at the trial and provided a personal character witness to Wolfe. Ultimately, Wolfe's sentencing was influenced by these powerful actors, and he was only sentenced to 4 years for being a member of the SS and being aware of the horrible crimes. Once again, the restless Dulles lobbied a bit more and got his sentence reduced to time served. Wolfe was a free man in Europe in June 1949. So I really wanted to illustrate this story because it just, first of all, I think it's a very interesting story just from a purely intelligence point of view. It reads much like a real-life James Bond story, maybe a bit of a perverted one since, the forces that the OSS were fighting for at this time were not exactly noble. But also, I wanted to raise this just to show what the fate of these people ended up being, especially Karl Wolfe. So Karl Wolfe lived out the rest of his days in post-war Germany, working as an advertising executive, as he had before the war. In the 1950s, he would form a neo-fascist party in Germany called Rexenferat. I might have mispronounced that. And in 1956, he formed a men's club for former SS officers. Thanks to Dulles' hard work and determination, another horrible Nazi war criminal walked freely in post-war Europe. And that had been the plan from the beginning, to keep as many of these elements around to be used in the post-war environment. Up to this point, we have discussed Allen Dulles' exploits during the Second World War at the OSS in detail. But there were many other notable future CIA officers around him at the OSS that were working towards the same missions, that I think are equally as important to talk about. So with that being said, let's talk about James Jesus Angleton, the OSS station chief in Rome during World War II, and the future director of counterintelligence at the CIA until the 1970s. So we're talking about a long and enduring legacy with intelligence. Let's get into it. James Jesus Angleton was the son of Hugh Angleton, the owner of the National Cash Register Company and the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Italy. Hugh also worked with the OSS during the war, and was likely the reason his son was put in charge of the X2 program in Italy, the OSS's counterintelligence branch. Angleton Jr. was a Yale graduate, an avid poet, and also deeply paranoid for his entire life. Throughout his intelligence career, Angleton would skulk around the office buildings he occupied, accusing colleagues of communist sympathies and searching every room he entered for hidden bugs. Despite his paranoia, Angleton was a master of deception. He was always in the background of some of the OSS and the CIA's most significant operation. His elusiveness and tall skeletal appearance earned him the nickname of the Ghost, or the Cadaver, by his colleagues. Angleton was, amongst many things, an Anglophile, a ruthless anti-communist, a devout Roman Catholic. He was largely amoral, and most importantly to his career aspirations, he viewed Allen Dulles as a second father and a mentor. While stationed in Italy during the Second World War, Angleton would help Dulles smuggle key fascist elements out of occupied territories, most notably Junio Valerio Borghese, otherwise known as the Black Prince. Who was this Black Prince? Well, Junio Valerio Borghese was a former member of the Catholic black nobility, a fascist segment of the Italian aristocracy that had deep running connections with the Vatican. Throughout the war, Borghese fought alongside the Italian fascists, and unlike many of Mussolini's followers, the Black Prince refused to surrender. Late into the war, he led a short-lived, quote, solo republic, which was a group of hardline fascists that held out against partisan advances in northern Italy, even after Italy signed an armistice with the Allies in 1943. He led a militia group called Xmas that perpetuated untold horrors on the communist partisans funded by the Italian Communist Party, otherwise known as PCI. The Black Prince had crossed paths with good old General Wolfe before he was deported to a POW camp. The meeting was held at a villa on Garter Lake, and was also attended by Angleton. At this meeting, the Black Prince agreed to cooperate with the OSS's secret Operation Sunrise if he received clemency for his crimes. This debt was repaid, as when the Black Prince was arrested for war crimes in May of 1945, Angleton personally secured his release and picked him up from his detention center when he was freed in Milan. After freeing the Black Prince, Angleton and Wild Bill Donovan toyed with the idea of a scheme to install Borghese as the new king of Italy, at least in the Catholic-dominated South. Instead, they opted for a less high-profile plan, using Borghese as the commander of Gladio forces in Italy. So, Borghese was given U.S. State Department funds under the auspices of, quote, operational resources for the formation of an Italian police force and military. And just like that, the Black Prince was the commander of a shadow army in Italy. Borghese organized his army into 40 groups, 10 of which specialized in sabotage, 6 in espionage, propaganda, and escape tactics, which was essentially just another word for smuggling war criminals to South America and the Middle East, and a staggering 12 divisions dedicated to guerrilla fighting. These units were trained at the Italian island of Sardinia and pulled from hardline fascists and Italian monarchists. The groundwork for Gladio, the CIA's secret and murderous campaign against European communists, was set. The Black Prince, Earnhard Gehlen, and General Karl Wolff would get to work recruiting the future gladiators to perpetuate violence against leftists, orchestrate false flag events, and ensure that European fascism remained alive in a hidden but powerful network. But we will be saving all that for future parts. That's all I've got for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. I am overwhelmed with the support that you've given me for my first part. Thank you so much for that. That really goes a long way and keeps me motivated to keep making these parts. For the next episode, just to give you a sneak preview, we're going to be looking at the OSS's activities in Asia, specifically in China and Southeast Asia in Burma. This will be an interesting link to draw, especially with future OSS operations and the French connection, and its instrumental link to Gladio. But that's for the next part. As for today, I hope you enjoyed this part. Please, as always, share any of your thoughts you have down in the comments. I read every single comment and I appreciate all of the feedback, so thank you so much. I hope the audio was a little bit better in this part. I do realize that it was quite quiet in the last part, so I did my best to try to make it louder in this one. So hopefully that's been fixed. With that being said, thank you again for watching. A like is free and it goes a long way to help me in the algorithm. Anything else, as well as like a subscribe, for example, goes a long way. So thank you so much for continuing to watch this series, and we will see you again shortly. Remember, always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.